1871. In 1871, corporate color of law was enshrined by de facto DC incorporation via DC Act of 1871. Where the first constitution is organic, the second constitution is literally the corporate constitution. Yes, corporations have their own U.S. Constitution, from 1871. Human beings were given corporatehood via corporate personhood and federation of state persons under the U.S. governmental corporation. The legal presence corporate overlay went into effect with birth certificates through the Shepard-Towner Maternity Hygiene Act of 1921, that make financial securities out of children. The act has since been superseded. The Uniform Commercial Code was definitive slavery in making human beings into chattel. Human chattel is defined as slavery, yet birth certificates make us persons, and it uses UCC to do it. The 1938 implementation of bankruptcy statutory code allowed the human chattel via legal presence to go into hyperdrive. UCC became ubiquitous among the states. UCC would be best considered color of law over color of law. During the 1800s, various forms of law were being developed. In Louisiana, for instance, was a Nepolionic code state. However, even the incorporated color of law Napoleonic Code of Louisiana was superseded by UCC slave code in the early 1900s. By 1938, statutory slavery was fully established across America. The UCC control over U.S. citizen legal presences was very short-lived, as after World War II, all nations were taken over by the United Nations in 1948. The United States authority still comes from the Vatican. The Vatican City controls Washington, D.C. As evidence that the Vatican controls the United States and the Rothschild Central Bank, the Federal Reserve Note states very clearly, "In God we trust," which is better defined as, "In the Vatican City we a state person corporation franchises." The statutory control mechanism of 1938 lasted until 1948, when the United Nations created the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United States District of Columbia Municipal Corporation tries to control the war, murder, power franchise. They also attempted to control the magic franchise, despite obvious material conflicts with the church and state. The U.S. House of Representatives. "In God we trust" in gold above the U.S. flag, and beside two fascios, bundle of sticks with axes, and the symbol of Mussolini, the fascist that gave sovereign city-state status to the Vatican. The seat and head of the United Nations. The United Nations. The League of Nations was created upon ending World War I to institutionalize peace and security, financial security. It lasted 26 years before the United Nations took over many of its bodies and functions on April 20, 1946, from the bankruptcy of the League of Nations after World War II. When the United Nations was put in place, everything changed. All member countries and national citizens became UN citizens under the United Nations. The United Nations is the League of Nations operating from bankruptcy, and was why they required all UN member nation corporations to operate from bankruptcy as terms and conditions. The UN licenses all legal presences to UN member nations. The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights entitled the UN to claim all human beings under a federated, sovereign corporation, just like the North claimed the legal presences of the South. Where the 13th Amendment made slavery non-discriminatory, the United Nations made the same legal presence slavery non-discriminatory across the globe. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1948. It encodes that all nations were found lacking in their abuse of legal presences, particularly for enacting war and war crimes. The UN then became the single and only legal authority across the whole planet. The United Nations has specifically replaced all courts globally with national competent tribunals. They look like national courts, but they are not. So where UCC is color of law of legalized King's common law, the UN put another color of law overlay on top of all UN member nations. This was why prosecutors in US courtrooms claimed their masters to be the United Nations. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, head of all member nation states. The UNUDHR was created to remove, entitle all human rights under the name of peace and security, underwriting of the United Nations. The Security Council underwrites all global securities and human rights. The 5-seated UN member nations on the Security Council, United States Inc. for DC, Russia Inc., China Inc. for the Chinese elders, France Inc. in lieu of the Vatican via the Avignon Papacy, and the UK, City of London Crown Corporation. They write debts and serve them to countries as debt obligations for compliance. The UNUDHR was the primary global governing document, the person CORPORATEHOOD Constitution above all else. Even above the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution has clauses that give international treaties more power than itself. That was the basis of the UN takeover of the DC Corporation. The terms and conditions of having licensing the UN person insurance franchise was the birth certificate and a total imposition of UN code over all legal presences and thus courtrooms globally. All national laws seem to be at the sufferance of the United Nations and allowed only to present the appearance of legitimacy. No national laws may go against the UN Charter, nor human rights. All nations must abuse its citizenry as corporate legal fictions called persons, according to the rules of the United Nations. The UNUDHR removes all human rights when simply claiming to be human and have rights. They impose the personhood, corporatehood overlay by UNUDHR Article 6 that everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. A person before the law means an artificial person under their fictional legalisms. Essentially, courts cannot make anyone guilty without using legal presences under the UN. All legal presence use must have UN approval. Human beings are guilt-free at all times, until the legal corporate overlay was applied. The implications are huge. Even murder is okay for non-persons in the UN legal construct. Murder cannot be held accountable by nations because of World War II. Only the UN may hold murderers accountable because nations were too violent with their legal fictions. However, natural law still applies, and murder at the natural law has significant impacts and influences outside the control of any corporation, call in karmic kickback. Put another way, the golden rule still applies. Essentially, harm to a person was harm to the United Nations. These legalisms are imposed to deceptively gain consent of the human beings. It also spiritually enables the UN and member states to have no karmic consequences. If people agree by ignorance, they are allowed to do it. Only when we do not consent does karma give a hand at natural law. Informed non-consent was important to stopping the physical slavery. The UNUDHR has a few very interesting features to it. First, the only way a nation may be a member is by entering bankruptcy. It must be a bankrupt nation to obligate itself via debt to the UN. Second, the UN underwrites all human rights by titling them for their ownership. Thus all human rights may be removed by UN if we allow them to have title our rights. Each bar attorney uses that executor trust authority to give themselves the power of assumption over the deceased legal person estate created by the Vatican. All rights are property underwritten in such ways. We must title our own rights if we are to own them. The UNUDHR specifically underwrites children, marriage, and education as titled human rights. This is in alignment with birth certificates looking like vehicle titles acting as titles to our human body, and students also having birth certificate-like documents. The University of Michigan Financial Department told me that prior to 2001, the university issued birth certificate-like documents for each student. And marriages are businesses. All these rights are underwritten with debt for insurance by the United Nations. In effect, there are no more U.S. Treasury windows for American nationals because the function was taken over by the UN in 1948. The UN takeover is also reason why the sovereign man UCC-1 finance statements, etc. won't work. Furthermore, there are hundreds of legal presences for any single human being. Filing one UCC-1 finance statement doesn't cover all of them. Each legal presence must be specifically taken possession of, otherwise, the UN owns the legal fiction. Each time the uppercase name is written down, it is technically a separate legal fiction and sub-franchise person of the UN. No one but the UN may own and use legal presences. No, even the human beings operating with legal presence were allowed to relate the legal presence. Being non-attorneys, human beings are not allowed to step into the legal presence. The application of legal presences was entirely unjust and based upon illegal adhesion contracts by UN member nations. Geneva, June 9, 2010. Xinhua, photo taken on June 9, 2010 shows the buildings of the Palace of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. The Palace of Nations in Geneva was built between 1929 and 1936 as the headquarters of the League of Nations. It has served as the home of the United Nations office in Geneva since 1946, when the UN Secretary-General signed the headquarters agreement with the Swiss authorities, although Switzerland did not become a UN member until 2002. To summarize, the UN is a nation of nations. Their unofficial headquarters is the Palace of Nations is a sovereign city-state in the sovereign city-state of the Republic and Canton of Jesuit-controlled Geneva, Switzerland. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 took over all nations. UCC was used as the international code to operate the UN takeover. The UN is color of law on top of color of law of color of law of legalized King's Code. The United Nations is ultimately a crown corporation operating the Third Vatican crown. The Vatican City only has permanent observer status due to not wanting to give of control over their legal presences to the UN City of London Crown Corporation. Flag of New York City State, where Donald Trump was birthed. The land mass of the United Nations territory is New York City. Just like the DC is a corporation operating the United States, New York City is the sovereign city-state owned and operated by the United Nations. New York City issues their own birth certificates, just like the District of Columbia. New York City birth certificates are not United States birth certificates. Donald Trump has a New York City birth certificate. It is authorized within the United States because the UN has taken full and total control over the United States and all member nations. New York City was the United Nations sovereign city-state. This is also why New York City policy and forces are independent of the United States, just like the DC Metro Police are independent of all federal United States policy. New York City is defined in the federal regulations as the United Nations. Rudolph Giuliani stated on C-SPAN that New York City was the capital of the world, and he was correct. 20 CFR Chapter 111, Subpart B 422.103, B22, shows that New York City is equal to that of District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. New York City issues their own birth certificates, unlike all other states, except District of Columbia. Where the Vatican City tries to control the trust, spiritual franchise, City of London tries to control the money, debt franchise, and DC tries to control the war, magic franchise, then the UN tries to control the person franchise, slavery and all things legal. The UN tries to control all things legal. The UN would be the fourth city-state. CERN, in Geneva. CERN was a scientific complex running the largest and most powerful machine on the Earth, the Large Hadron Collider. The LHC was initially sold to the public for a maximum energy of 14 TeV. They recently reached over 2,360 TeV. CERN gave 2017 presentations to the Bilderberg Group to gain funding for their new super collider, the Future Circular Collider that proposes to be 3x the power of LHC at 100 TeV. However, given the math, they might be able to reach 40,000 TeV with such a machine. The new proposed super collider FCC 3x the size of LHC. CERN was given sovereign city-statehood by the Crown Corporation's Diplomatic Corp. CERN has their own body of law and is not obligated to any country's laws. CERN's legal code is copyright by the IMF, making the CERN legal presences owned by the UN, without exception. CERN was in the Republic and Canton of Geneva until CERN split with the world, not just splitting atoms and creating black holes. CERN as its own city-state even has its own debt security council that issues debt securities in any measure it needs. They have created tens of billions for themselves in running the machine.